Hello and welcome to part 4 of overview of the GRAD architecture. GRAD again being GraphQL, React, Apollo, and Django. So this time I'm going to be talking about the front end and specifically using Apollo client to ingest your GraphQL data. Before I get started, I want to talk about a little bit of the pain of React development, either in learning or in execution. And I think this was at least the difficulty for me. I've heard from many other people this was the difficulty as well. Essentially, you have props and you have state. Props is the data that's being passed around to other components, or if you're accessing it inside your component, it's what came from someplace else. And you have state, which is all of the data that's concerned interior to your component, which is well and good, except you also have two other data concerns, which are you have data that's just inside your UI of your UI application that you're passing around, and you also have data that's coming from your backend or from other locations. And because you can pass state around, because you can pass props around, that gets very muddled. And typically the solution to that has been something like Redux or MobX. And additionally, when you're dealing with particularly data that's coming from the back end, you have asynchronous calls because you're waiting for things to load, and you oftentimes have to utilize the lifecycle components, which is did mount, will mount, unmount, things like that. And that's not to say that lifecycle components are only utilized in this use case, because I can think of a handful of use cases where you could use lifecycle components just interior to your React component without dealing with a backend call at all. But I have found that oftentimes when you're dealing with stuff that's coming from the backend, you have to use lifecycle components to really work with what's happening interior to your component, or really cleverly use Redux and MobX to try to deal with those concerns. But that is what makes React very complicated, or at least that's where people have difficulty in learning React, including myself. Now, when I was initially looking at Redux, I looked for something simpler. I found GraphQL, and I have not looked back, and I've heard that same testimonial from a lot of people. It drastically simplifies React development. It just makes it a lot easier, and I want to talk about that and the reasons why now. So first of all, let's talk about, on the left, component state, which is everything that's related to this .state. So you've got all of that data that's just related to the UI and related to that specific component. It can be passed around, and changes are typically dealt with this .set state or on-change handlers. React has a lot of tools that make it very easy to deal with all of that, and it does a very good job of handling that. The asynchronous calls and the confusion and the pain usually comes with everything that's on the right-hand side, like I said earlier, the data state, which is anything that's usually coming from props. And again, I'm specifically talking about stuff that's related to data coming from the back end. It can be passed to different React components, and that's usually, without GraphQL and without Apollo, why you need something like Redux or MobX. And typically, again, why the lifecycle components come into play. When you have Apollo client and you have GraphQL in play, you don't have to worry about the vast majority of what's happening on the right-hand side. You really only have to worry about 4 major concerns, which are: did the data error out? Is it loading currently? Has it arrived? And what happens if I do a create, update, or delete operation, so cut operations? So yeah, CRUD minus the R, so not just reading. Well, no, reading too, because you got to worry about whether it's arrived or not. So CRUD operations, I'll leave it at that. But as far as the 4 concerns, you only need to worry about, I'm getting a little bit off rail. We'll continue. Anyway, Apollo client, it takes care of a lot of that for you. It makes it a lot easier because you're splitting out the data side from the back end to just Apollo client. It handles it. And again, all you have to worry about is when something errors, what are you doing? When it is loading, what are you doing? When the data's arrived, what are you doing? And usually that's when you're doing something within your UI. Again, also, if there's some sort of change that's happening within the back end, you can do a refetch query interior to UI, and it handles that very well. And as a result, and my argument here is that it drastically simplifies React development. You'll see all sorts of testimonials all over the place that it reduces the amount of code you need to write, that it just makes it a lot easier. A lot of people will argue that you do not need Redux and MobX once you're working with Apollo client with GraphQL. But I'm not going to go that far. If you do still need it, or if you're in transition, you can actually hook, I believe, both Redux and MobX into Apollo client if you have that need. Anyway, whether you're using Relay or Apollo client or anything along those lines, you're going to have to work with GraphQL tag. Well, I should say, if you have a GraphQL backend, you're going to need GraphQL tag. And essentially what that is the library on the front end that lets you define the schema that you're making the call to the backend. So the backend is going to have all those schema that has different things available. The example query here that I'm calling the examples query might have other fields, might have ID, other field 2, other field 3, excuse me. But here you're constructing whatever you want from that specific client from the front end call. Now, I do want to make a quick comment on data structure. You can either put all of these GraphQL tag calls that you're constructing into a single data folder, or you can just plop it directly in your component. If you're putting it right in your component, it's a little bit clearer within the code as far as what you need to do. If you're plopping it in a data directory, if you're making changes to a single data call that you know that's just going to affect a lot of things, it's in one isolated place, so it can be a little bit easier to work with in that regard. I usually, when I'm developing, plop the call right into my code, and then I move it into a data folder to import later. I'm not going to say one's superior to the other. I think they just each have their strengths and weaknesses. I have heard of some people that they were like, oh man, I wish I had done that earlier in a different project. So I just wanted to make you guys aware of that just in case it's relevant to you in your use case. So again, with Apollo Client, you got whether you're using, and I'm going to talk about two different ways to use it. You can either use higher order components, or you can use a hook that they've created, or specifically a React hook, which make it look a little bit like a React component. But regardless, you're going to have to deal with the three different states, and that's data.loading. And again, you can return a component or just literally loading text like I did here. You have data.err. Here again, I'm returning data.err, but I have that comment that's empty. Infinite possibilities. You can do a redirect. You can return the error text. You can do all sorts of things. Or you can return, again, the operation within the UI of the actual data that's been, but those are the three things you just need to handle. And that's it. Once you've got those handled, you're off and running. I also want to make a comment here. I do the two if statements, I believe, in the official Apollo document, and I just do that for clarity. In the official Apollo documentation, I believe they prefer object destructuring, so they actually have the loading, error, and data, and then they expect just dumping out into something, an object, and then you're just supposed to reference it from there. Anyhow, this is option one, which is useQuery, which is the React hook, which gives you kind of a component-ish look. I will be honest with you, I prefer the higher order component method, but I just want to make sure you're aware of this because looking at Apollo Client, I believe they're talking about deprecating the higher order component option, which I'm not sure why, mostly because I feel like the higher order component section gives me more flexibility and it's just easier to work with. Specifically in the use case when you're dealing with a query and a mutation or two queries together. If you're using two queries together, I believe the official line is you should use fragments or you should just make a combined query. I think, honestly, it's just easier to use higher order components to deal with that particular issue, but that's that, just so you're aware of it. And I'm sure I'm just talking at you guys and you're like, I'm not sure what you're talking about, but you will eventually. And I'll cover it actually in the next couple slides. But anyway, this is an example of just using the React component-ish view of it. So you define the query thing up top. You say query equals whatever query you're firing. If there's variables that you're inserting, you can actually define those within that top query tag, and then you close it off there at the bottom and do, again, all the loading, error handling, the data handling in there as well. And I believe they actually cast it directly to loading and error and data, which does simplify things a little bit, but you can do something similar with higher order components. I don't like this method as much just because I like keeping the data segregated in a different portion of the code to make it a little bit more clear. So option 2, higher order components. Again, you don't have to use this, but do what works for you. In this instance, what you're doing is you define your UI. After you're going to need to import GraphQL, which is the call to, or compose, which is the call to do that wrapping with the higher order component. And then what you do down below is you call GraphQL, you throw in whatever that schema call you were doing from GraphQL tag, and then you tell it some component. And there's also a little bit of hidden bit after that comma. There's a bunch of options and things that you can call in between there. You can, if it's a mutation, you can say, okay, these are the things we're refetching. You can do variable redefinition. You can do things with props. You can do all sorts of stuff in between there, which I recommend looking at the Apollo Client high order component documentation to see what you can do there. So in this instance, this is what it would look like, which again looks a little bit more like that introductory slide a few slides ago, where you're dealing with this.props.data.loading. You got to handle it. This.props.data.error, handle it, so on and so forth. And then there at the bottom again, you're wrapping it all together and sending it off. I like this method again because it splits off what the UI is doing and what's happening as far as the data call as well. And I just feel like it's a little bit simplified, a little bit more clear, and there's a little bit more separation as far as what's happening in each section and what the responsibilities are. Anyway, if you want, you can do this sort of thing, and this is some of those functions I was talking about that were hidden after that comma. You can cast your props to be named something else. So in this instance, rather than having to type this.data or this.props.data.error, I just have to do this.props.error. Same thing with loading, and you can see I took data.examples and actually made it this.props.values instead. And the code down below is me being lazy. It shouldn't be if error, it should be this if this.props.error return so on and so forth, and same thing with values down below. But you can see values would be the examples coming out. And again, there are a lot of fun options of things you can do in between there. I feel like higher order components just gives you a lot of control. And this is particularly useful if you're dealing with two query calls. So say you have two queries that are firing within the same component for some reason, or a query and a mutation. You can actually cast things in such a way where you are isolating the error state of one from the error state of another, the loading state of one from the loading state of another, and also separate the data out. So in the top portion, you can see I'm saying error is going to be data.error, loading is going to be data.loading. Query 1 is what's coming in from examples, and then below I'm making error 2, loading 2, and query 2. And that way, if one is erroring out and not the other, I can maybe throw out a particular error call. If one is loading and not the other, I can shoot out a particular loading call, and I feel like it gives a little bit more control. In this instance, when you are doing more than one, or a query and a mutation, you're going to need to use, basically whenever you're dealing with more than just one, you're going to have to use compose rather than the GraphQL call, which is reflected down below. And I believe that is the end of this presentation. And I think with this, you guys have all the tools you need to at least make a read-only web application, which is a lot of web applications. So I highly recommend to just go ahead and get started, have some fun. If you want a project to contribute to, or if you want to take a look at, I'm not going to cover mutations in this particular set of slides, mostly because I have a lot of examples of mutations and mutation calls and data structures and everything along those lines in the BRIMS project I'm working on. I'm going to move into the data series specifically covering BRIMS, what needs to be done. If you feel like contributing to a project, or feel like looking at some code and some code examples for your own use cases as far as what to do, please feel free to look at the BRIMS repo. If you feel like there's some improvements that can be made to the BRIMS repo, please dive in. Open source projects, would love the help. I don't consider myself a 10x guy at all. I'm just a guy who knows a lot of different stuff, and I'm cheap for what I do. So with that closes us out. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Feedback is absolutely welcome. One last comment is if you're running into problems when you're implementing this on your own, the best places to look currently are not on Stack Overflow, but the GitHub pages of the various products, and just doing searches in there for your various keywords. So look in issues and then make sure it's closed issues as well, either in Graphene Django, within the Graphene project, or within Apollo Client. So with that, thanks for listening. Feedback again welcomed, and happy coding.